Everybody is very welcome, and I just want to thank the participants for joining. We're going to hear today from speakers from their perspective, and we all have different memories, those of us old enough to remember when we started hearing about HIV and AIDS. I, as a young student nurse back in 1981, and the situation has evolved over the 40 years to where we are now. There are a few slides I want to show, very simple, and then we'll go into a 2-minute video, thankfully from UNAIDS, reminding us of the 40 years. But for those of us who don't remember back then, in 81, the beginning of AIDS was reported in the USA, in San Francisco, California, where it was mostly homosexual men who were infected, affected, and sadly dying. By a decade later, the epicenter had moved to Sub-Saharan Africa, where 6 million adults were estimated to have been infected. In 2001, a decade later, 40 million people were reportedly living with HIV and AIDS globally, UNAIDS data, and up to 400 million people directly affected. Every person living with HIV at least directly affected 10 other people, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, work colleagues, etc. A decade later, in 2011, the UN General Assembly had a meeting to review progress on HIV and AIDS. And thankfully, following greater access to ARVs during the decade previous, they reported that HIV infection rates had fallen by 25% in 2011. Next slide, please. In 2021, now we do know, and Spangale will be reporting on it, and Laurel, that we did not meet the global 2020 targets on HIV and AIDS. And as everybody knows, there's been great disruption to testing, treatment, care, and support services here in Ireland, in Kenya, in South Africa, globally, due to the latest pandemic, COVID-19. Today, 4 in 5 people living with HIV know their status. 2 in 3 are on treatment. 60% of people have viral suppressed loads. But sadly, over 40% of people are still not accessing treatment and virally suppressed. Worse still, only 53% of children living with HIV globally are on treatment. And even worse in terms of the response, the funding has decreased by 7% between 2017 and 2019. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one before we see the video. So currently, 38 million people globally are living with HIV, 2019 data. 1.7 million became infected in 2019. So it's still every day, yesterday, today, tomorrow, 4,500 new infections every day. Almost 60% are in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's great that James is here from Kenya to speak to this. Since the beginning of the HIV pandemic, almost 80 million people have been infected and 35 million people have died from AIDS-related illnesses globally over the past 4 decades. The last slide is just an infograph coming up before we look at the 2-minute video clip. Anybody wants to look into this later, the link is at the bottom. Thanks a lot, and over to the 2-minute video clip. And thanks to UNAIDS. Are you there, Joan or Maisie? Are you able to show the video clip? Thanks very much to you and AIDS. That was a sobering, yet shows the progress over the past 40 years. And I'll hand over to Joan now so we can hear from our important speakers coming up. Thanks, Joan.
Thank you, Breda. So our first panelist needs no introduction to lots of us here. Welcome to Sibongile, Nicole Sico, Executive Director of the Global Network of People Living with HIV based in South Africa. Sibongile is an award-winning journalist, an organisational leader and advocate for social change. She has worked for Treatment Action Campaign and was the first Black woman to lead a health news agency in South Africa. We have more detail in the chat for anybody who would like to see the full biography of speakers. I'll move next to Laurel. Laurel Sprague is head of UN AIDS Community Engagement Division in Geneva. Laurel has almost 3 decades of experience in the HIV response. Her focus has been on the empowerment and leadership of networks of people living with HIV. Laurel works to address stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV. And our next speaker is Noel Donlan, filmmaker and photographer and a member of ACT UP Dublin. He has worked globally in the film business since 1992. His documentary film work has brought him to such countries as Kenya, Rwanda, DRC, Pakistan, Sweden, USA, and many more. Noel recently co-directed and photographed Shameless, a film which premiered at yesterday's Gays Film Festival in Dublin. Ronan Sweeney, our next guest, is Development Specialist Officer in the Global Health, HIV and AIDS team in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland. Ronan is responsible for managing HIV and AIDS partners and contributing to the achievement of the global health objectives as set out in Ireland's international development policy. He is the focal point for Ireland's tenure on the board of the Global Fund and has worked in Asia, Africa and Europe in peace building and in humanitarian and development programming. And finally, James Njuguna, our Education and HIV Program Manager in Concern Worldwide in Kenya. James is an educationist with 19 years experience working with vulnerable children. He has worked for 10 years in HIV and AIDS and 9 in basic education. And since 2015, he has led the implementation of a life skills and mentorship program with adolescent girls. So welcome to all of our speakers. I'll hand back to Breda now. Over to you, Breda. You're on mute.
Sibongile. Over to Sibongile and welcome. Delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Breda. It's no doubt that the HIV response has made many strides in the past 40 years in making sure people living with HIV have access to life-saving treatment and also improving their healthcare outcomes. However, the effectiveness of the HIV response is highly variable between populations and geographies. The HIV epidemic in the Sub-Saharan Africa region is generalized by continued inequalities in the treatment of marginalized communities, including queer population, and this hinders access to health services and the quality of care. The weak health systems are not responsive to the needs of the marginalized communities. With this said, though, the HIV networks continue to be at the center of driving and leading the HIV response in these regions, from leading the struggles for access to treatment, to ongoing communities, to going into communities, to educating those infected by the disease and how to stay healthy. It is the networks that continuously respond to the needs of people living with HIV. We continue to organize ourselves. We continue to champion ourselves in fighting for the rights of our people, those that live with HIV specifically. We also lead our own community responses, including applying different approaches for community healthcare workers to support communities in accessing healthcare services. We also continue to monitor and document the failures in quality of HIV and TB service delivery, as well as the broader health systems in various settings. In Kenya, the HIV networks continues to scale up innovative approaches to HIV testing and providing door-to-door services. In different settings, we continuously implement the HIV Stigma Index to study the levels of stigma and discrimination experienced by people living with HIV in all their diversity. This has been an effective tool for communities and governments to design programs and policies that tackle stigma and discrimination. In Tanzania, the networks led evidence-based advocacy on lowering the age of consent for an HIV test. The International Community of Women Living with HIV led the advocacy on ending forced sterilization and lodged a complaint on behalf of 48 women living with HIV who suffered forced or coerced sterilization in hospitals. Young people living with HIV from the youth networks continuously volunteer as peer educators to ensure that their peers adhere to treatment, but also feel resilient, have self-worth, and are actively engaged in the quality of the care that they receive. Through the global partnership to eliminate stigma and discrimination, GNP Plus and other partners are working with UN agencies and the global funds along with the governments to tackle stigma in our areas. This time is a critical time to deal with the barriers in achieving our global goals to ending AIDS by 2020. The global strategy and the political declaration have affirmed and given us the political tools to prioritize actions to fight stigma, discrimination, and realize human rights. However, there are critical questions to also respond to at this time. How do we deal with the uncertainty that COVID-19 presents to us? People living with HIV are disengaging with health services for many reasons. And how do we make sure they do not experience even more discrimination when they re-engage? Is the investment in communities sufficient to enable us to continue to do our work? Our mission now should be to focus on community-led response actions at country level. This means to support coordination to ensure that the resources for communities deliver on this work and accountability mechanisms to monitor the progress. At global level, we have identified the path for the HIV response for the next 5 years through the political declaration and the ongoing work of the development of the Global Fund and the PEPFAR strategy. However, we need to ensure that there's enough investment and resources to actually implement these commitments. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thanks very much, Spongale. Absolutely, investment in communities to fuel the response going forward is critical, and you spoke eloquently about the challenges in a time of COVID-19 ongoing. We move next to Geneva, to Laurel from UNAIDS, who will speak about inequalities and related issues. Over to you, Laurel, and much thanks for your participation.
Rita, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And on behalf of UNAIDS, I just really want to thank all of you for inviting us and for sharing the video that we've put together. I think for some of us that have been around for a while, I'll echo what you said, Rita. It's poignant to look at the video and look at those earlier years. And those graphs, which almost always bring tears to my eyes, because when we see the numbers going up of deaths, we know many of those people that were those data points. And so it continues to be, really something that I think fuels our advocacy for a lot of us. UNAIDS has, I think, as many people may have noticed, really come forward with a strong focus on inequalities as the fundamental organizing principle that we all think we need to adopt if we're actually going to end the AIDS epidemic and end it for everyone, not only for those who have the easiest access or the best private health insurance or other kinds of privileges that we think everyone really should have. But if we're really going to talk about how we make no deaths, no discrimination, no new infections a reality in our world, then we really have to be thinking about those most left behind. And I apologize for using this phrase that we've all heard so many times that I think people stop hearing it. But it really is the case that we have profound inequalities. And more than ever in today's HIV epidemic than ever before. Just a few quick data points, and I can share a link to our most recent Global AIDS update where more information is available. But people may have seen that now we've moved from 50% of new infections being among key populations and their partners just a few years ago to 64% in 2020. Every year over year, we see an increase in the percentage of new infections that are borne by gay men and other men who have sex with men, including bisexual men, transgender people, people who use drugs, and sex workers, as well as people who are in prison and in closed settings. So that's a profound inequality. Adolescent girls now make up 6 out of 7 new infections among adolescents in Sub-Saharan Africa. Children, as you noticed, only about half of children who have HIV have access to the ARVs that they need to stay alive, much less the nutritional support and other kinds of services that they need. And I think that too often people might hear these numbers and think that there is something about key populations or adolescent girls, not so much children, that somehow they're doing something wrong and that's why they don't have access to the care and services that they need. And I think that that's, it's convenient for those who don't want to do anything, and it stops those who want to do something and don't know what to do. I think what we really need to focus on is when we see numbers like this, it is absolutely clear that these are failures of health systems and approaches that are not adequately reaching, engaging, and providing care to the people that need them. Bottom line, what do we need to do? A few things, and I'm so grateful to speak after Spangile. Excuse me while my dog joins us for a moment. Hopefully he'll be gone in a minute. Doesn't it always happen this way? He's going out for his walk. So excuse me for that. So really, I'm saying I really appreciate speaking after Spangile because her focus on community-led responses is really a focus that UNAIDS has adopted as well, recognizing that governments, of course, are the primary duty bearers for making sure that everyone in the country has access to the systems and services that they need. We know that for key populations, for young people, for people living with HIV, the most effective interventions that we have are peer-led. They come from the community themselves, and we're really calling for increased investment in community-led responses. We worked with governments in the high-level meeting and the political as they negotiated the declaration that was agreed in June to help create the foundation for strong targets for supporting community-led responses. And I just want to be clear that we're not saying in any way that governments aren't responsible, but that they can partner with communities in their country to make the best use of the always dwindling funds we have in HIV, but also to most effectively reach the people who often are unreached or are reached in ways that aren't meeting their needs, and make sure that they have education, prevention education, treatment literacy, and linkages to services that they need. We know that when we have strong community ecosystems, that they can do exactly what Sibongile was discussing in terms of GMP Plus and ICW, which is that networks from regional to global and back to country level provide information and support to their networks. That there's a reason that we've called the PLHIV network work a self-empowerment movement, as people work together to reduce shame and empower one another. And also to conduct research, community-led monitoring, and where appropriate to directly provide services. Certainly we have really strong evidence that peer-led, key population-led, and youth-led prevention services are the most effective, are often the most effective prevention services. And likewise for young people and not so young people living with HIV, peer-led, peer support services are tremendously effective in supporting adherence, addressing mental health and social support needs, and linking people to the care that they need. So member states, I think have really recognized and been very supportive of UN member states, have been really supportive of this push to focus more on community leadership and community-led responses. And in the political declaration that was negotiated in June, set targets that by 2025, 30% of testing and treatment services should be community-led, 80% of prevention services, particularly for key populations, including women key populations, should be community-led. By community-led, we mean peer-led. And 60% of actions to address societal enablers should be community-led. And just to say a quick word on societal enablers, this is probably, in the political declaration, the attention to societal enablers is the strongest attention that we've ever had to issues of stigma, discrimination, criminalization, and violence, and reflects this shift in orientation that we've been trying to support for member states, communities, implementing partners, donors, and others, to attend to the inequities and inequalities, in particular stigma, discrimination, criminalization, and violence, and gender-based violence in particular, that continue to drive the epidemic. So they set really ambitious, member states set really ambitious targets, the 10-10-10 targets, on these issues, that fewer than 10% of all countries should have stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV, for example. These are going to be challenging to meet, but are absolutely fundamental for communities to be able to live with dignity, access the services they need, but also to organize and support their other community members and peers that may be even more marginalized, excluded, fearful, facing violence. We need that kind of opening of civic space so that the communities can organize, that community networks can organize and reach and serve those members of their communities as well. So as we move toward those goals, it's exactly what we need to open civic space and allow communities to mobilize for their own health and well-being. This is something I'm incredibly passionate about. So let me close my remarks there, but say that I really am happy to take questions and talk about this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurel. That was excellent. Absolutely. Community to peer-led responses, critically important. And serendipitously, we have James coming in now from Kenya, talking about a peer-led education with young people, adolescent girls and boys in informal settlements in Nairobi, which is kindly funded by Hovione Ireland and Irish Aid. So I'll hand over to James now, speaking to us from Nairobi. Thanks, James.
Thank you very much, Britta. I think I'll pick it up from where Spongile and Laura have left it. They have talked about the theme of inequality, which is basically what I'm going to be discussing, because our work is in the informal settlements of Nairobi, where 60%, so about 66% of the population of Nairobi live in very deplorable conditions. And our entry point is just like a follow-up of Father Michael Kelly call for education being the social vaccine for HIV and AIDS. And I think what we did and what we have been doing is we looked at the vulnerability of these children, and we identified life skills as one of the building blocks for helping these children to prevent HIV infections as children, as adolescents, and as future adults. Because when you look at it in so many ways, children living in the informal settlements are living in a cloud of, under a cloud, under a ceiling of so many challenges. Like life has already put on top of them a ceiling in so many ways. 66% of them cannot access public education. They attend low-cost private schools, which provide substandard education. That in itself kind of locks them up in the vicious circle of poverty that their parents are already living. And therefore you find in the informal settlements, due to intergeneration transmission of poverty, then you find like people's options are very limited. And as a result of people's options being very limited, coping mechanism for all ages expose them to HIV. So you'll find girls engaging in sex at a very tender age. You'll find girls at the age of 10 have already started childbearing and so on and so forth. Some of them have been pushed into commercial sex. You cannot call it commercial sex. It's basically transactional sex where they offer sex in exchange for favors. So how do you help such girls? How do you help such boys to build resilience in order to be able to overcome all these challenges? So we came up with a life skills model, which helps the boys and the girls to reflect on themselves. And it has 3 steps. Who am I? So they are able to interrogate themselves, define themselves in the midst of all these challenges, in the midst of all these, in a very complex environment. Who am I? And therefore, this one helps the girls and the boys to identify themselves as girls and boys, the changes in their bodies, the risks that are associated in the changes in their bodies, and how to manage those risks. And then even in the midst of all this, then we help the girls and the boys to ask themselves, where am I going? I mean, where is my future? So we help to build their self-esteem and aspirations to grow and break the ceiling. So we help them at a tender age of between 10 and 14 to be able to set goals for themselves, to be able to build their self-esteem and aspirations, be able to see beyond the ceilings that have been put there by policies and long years of deprivation. Then we also have tools that help these girls through the life skills program to be able to say, how will I get there? So they will be able to know how to make decisions, set goals, identify pitfalls that are along the way, look at issues of adolescent health, reproductive needs and risks that are available. And because one of the biggest challenges that we have in the informal settlements and for the young people in Kenya in general is limited access to reproductive health services. It's a big issue because of, 1, lack of facilities. Number 2, the stigma associated with reproductive health services and adolescents, because of the belief that reproductive health services are for adults, not adolescents. So that limits access to reproductive health services among young people. But thanks God, there's several organizations that are coming up, whom we partner with to promote adolescent reproductive health services for young people. But access is still a major challenge. So having said that, the COVID has also presented huge challenge for young people in Kenya. We have a problem of teen pregnancies, but we had a huge spike of teen pregnancies during the period when schools were closed because of the time, lack of supervision, and so many other issues that came up, economic challenges that came up. So what Concern did with support from Hovion and the Girls Education Challenge was to come up with very innovative ways of reaching out to the girls. And our focus was very simple. We had 3 objectives that we wanted to achieve. 1 was to keep the girls safe at home. 2, keep the girl learning so that they don't suffer learning loss. And 3, prepare the girls for reopening. And we came up with two-prong approach. One approach was to target the parents with messages on how to keep the girls safe at home. So we aired messages through radio and through community health volunteers. The second one was reaching out to the girls themselves, again through radio and through community health volunteers and also community learning centers. So we reached out to over 14,000 girls in the informal settlement with through community learning centers, through messages that were sent through community health volunteers during their visit. As they do awareness around COVID, they were also doing awareness around safety of girls, motivating the parents to keep the children learning and following the radio lessons, and also distributing tutorial materials to the girls. And as a result of that, when we resumed learning, 98% of our girls reported back to school. So actually, this confirms Father Kelly's, I would say, clarion call that we need to invest in education as the social vaccine for HIV/AIDS prevention. And I would say, by extension, for promoting adolescent and reproductive health. The longer we keep the boys and the girls in schools, the more we prevent them from adolescent reproductive health risk, and the more we are able to equip them with skills to protect themselves even when they become adults. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Yes, that's a sobering contribution from the informal settlements in Kenya, and the risk and vulnerability certainly of all those young girls who were out of school, especially from March 2020 when the schools were closed, and with COVID ongoing. We've a lot of catching up, the global we to do to protect and safeguard young girls and boys. And if teen pregnancy is happening, sex is happening, the age of consent is not being respected in Kenya and many other countries. And James reminded me earlier this week when we were discussing for this event that currently Kenya has the third largest epidemic in the world alongside Mozambique and Uganda, with the first case of HIV in Kenya detected in 1984. So a lot more to do. And thanks, James, for your contribution. And the comic books you've developed are excellent. Maybe we can discuss them further in the panel discussion.
Yep.
Our next speaker, moving to Noel from ACT UP Dublin. And Noel is going to speak about the media representation, as some of us have experienced, from 1981 until now 2021, from high attention in the early days, sometimes always not positive representation, to less attention with competing issues of conflict and COVID-19 now currently in 2021. I'll hand over to Noel, and thanks very much, Noel, for participating.
Thanks, Brita. And yeah, I heard about James's comics, which is really good, which is actually something we always talk about is we've got the local and the global. So ACT UP is obviously global, but it's also has local chapters, which are sort of independent. I'm going to sort of start with the very origins of sort of, there's always been artivism used with ACT UP, which is sort of ways of communicating messages out there. And from the very beginning, in fact, before ACT UP started, the Silence Equals Death project started with Brian Howard and Avram Finkelstein and others. And in fact, I'm wearing the first Irish language version designed by Brian Teeling, which Avram has seen and thinks is pretty cool. So I have to get him his Irish language version of the t-shirt. The Silence Equals Death project started on the streets. It was sort of wheat pastes in New York, got a lot of attention. And then the media started to pick up on that. And then when ACT UP set up, it co-opted that project essentially and took it over and ran with it. And that was a really, really clever sort of way of doing things in terms of activism, because most of the activism people involved, there were artists, graphic designers, some of them worked in advertising agencies, so they knew how to do things. And indeed, you know, artists like Keith Haring and David Wojnarowicz later, and the Irish artist Billy Quinn, who was a very early member of ACT UP in New York, sort of used imagery of the time. Some of it, as Breda said, was a bit dark back then, but it sort of had to be to nudge people. Whereas things have changed now, it's been a lot more positive regarding people living with HIV, and less sort of grim. So yeah, from the very beginning, ACT UP always had that sort of, that those people, they even had their own TV station, community channel called Diva TV, because a lot of people in ACT UP were working in television companies and stations in New York and whatnot. If we get on to ACT UP Dublin, just as to see how campaigns have sort of changed and shifted. We were one of the first sort of big advocates of the U=U campaign in Ireland. We started in 2016, U=U's undetectable equals untransmittable. So somebody living with HIV with an undetectable viral load unaffected from medication cannot pass the virus on through their sexual partner. So we started a sticker campaign, getting the messages out, and that was designed by Will St. Ledger. Again, artists are always a big part of this, of getting messages out. And then that U=U campaign literally went from the streets and stickers. In 2017 at Pride, we handed out 2,000 of those stickers, and then people printed their own ones off, and so on and so forth. So that really did start to spread. And then we sort of upped it and started working with media. We had advanced the campaign with Mask.life and Micromedia. Micromedia provides screens, advertising screens, and gave us space basically. So we started to use that campaign then in gyms initially, sort of captive audiences, to get the message across, and then that spread over a number of weeks, particularly in Dublin, onto the streets of Dublin. You'll see those screens in shops and windows. So we sort of used modern technology to go back on the street, which we'll get back to again, because COVID has been a difficult time for people campaigning in general, as has been mentioned. So we've also always worked with the media. Initially, that was a huge fight back in the 80s and 90s, but then we will often get calls now for the media who will and worldwide. We've had articles in the New York Times and everything else, particularly when we were focused on the HIV rates in Ireland and the need for PrEP. So that sort of fostered the PrEP campaign, which we led and got other NGOs involved with, and we sort of ran it. And now we do have a PrEP program in Ireland. And again, that was a sort of sticker campaign. And then and media interviews and radio and everything else. So we've always sort of used media when we can, and all media. And we also look now at sort of social media and digital campaigns. We've updated the U=U campaign now. My friend Pradeep has just done new graphics and whatnot, and that became very useful during particularly this last year and a half of COVID, of getting the message out through Instagram and social media. We also had a campaign to put pressure on opening the Gay Men's Health Service, GMHS, which was closed for pretty much the whole of certainly the first few lockdowns. And we had a forum then with Rory O'Neill on that as well. So we'll use whatever techniques that we need to do, whether it's on the street, whether it's wheat pastes, or whether it's advocacy. And we haven't been able to do that sort of out and about advocacy as much, although we can sort of start doing that again now. So for us, the use of social media has been really sort of important of late. And I'll just finish up with saying what Breda was saying, is that, you know, the messaging has very much changed, and in terms of trying to reduce stigma, we're always very positive about things, so that if you are living with HIV, there's the U=U message. If you're not, there's PrEP as prevention. We're great advocates for testing, so to know your status, and also trying to use sort of, you know, anti-stigma. Well, stigma in itself is a very complicated thing. There can be self-stigma as well, campaigns. So that's sort of where we're at, and that's sort of where we're moving forward to. On the one hand, we have these positive messages about living with HIV, but on the other hand, it's very important to realize that AIDS still exists. Far too many people die worldwide. And as a side note, David Wojnarowicz, who died in 1992 of AIDS-related illnesses, there was a retrospective to him in the Whitney Museum in New York in 2019, and every single reference of AIDS in the text referred to it in the past, like it doesn't exist anymore. And ACT UP New York had a silent demonstration for 3 days there, where they held rewritten cards as to what should be said. So that Whitney actually did change the exhibition text to let people know that AIDS is still an issue worldwide. That it's not all good news, but on the other hand, HIV science and things have moved on so much since the dark days of the 80s and 90s that Breda and myself and others would remember. That overall the message is positive, and that's sort of what we're working with.
Thanks very much, Noel. An important contribution there, absolutely. Activists, artists, campaigners, linking the local with the global HIV response has been a signature of, I would say, Ireland's response to HIV and AIDS locally and globally, and linking with what Laurel was saying there, the importance of advocacy and the growing incidence rates among key populations who often are finding it difficult to access the health services in the best of times, but certainly it's been even more challenging in the past 18 months with the COVID-19 outbreak or ongoing pandemic. And for some people online here, in terms of PrEP, putting my technical hat on, it's pre-exposure prophylaxis. So people who are at risk of contracting HIV can take medication every day to prevent them from contracting HIV, and also then they won't be able to pass it on to their sexual partner. So exposure and access to PrEP is increasingly important for people at high risk. And this is being rolled out in Ireland, but has been stalled somewhat by the services being closed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, moving ahead, last but not least among our speakers at the minute, and then we'll have as I say, a panel discussion looking at some of the very interesting questions there that have come in. Ronan Sweeney has joined Irish Aid, and he will be talking about Irish Aid's response to date. Has been a great supporter to the response and concern and other agencies, including UNAIDS, and going forward, planning for World AIDS Day coming up on the 1st of December. Over to you, Ronan. Thanks a million for joining.
Great, thank you very much, Breda. And it's nice to hear you say joined Irish Aid, because I'm happy to say I'm a former Concern Worldwide employee. So it's great to hear James speak as well on the programs on the ground. Yeah, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak here today. And I'd like to thank the Irish Global Health Network and Concern Worldwide have organised this event to mark 40 years of combating HIV and AIDS. As part of Irish Aid's Global Health HIV and AIDS team, it's definitely a privilege to speak alongside the other panelists today and the many of you on the call who are at the coalface of tackling HIV and AIDS. And maintaining that determination and compassion that you have for addressing this epidemic is definitely difficult in normal times, and now amidst the COVID pandemic, it requires a redoubling of efforts and collaboration, and it's events like this that really are putting it back on the agenda against COVID. It's difficult, I suppose, in terms of looking back at the last 40 years of this epidemic, with numbers, staggering numbers, 35 million deaths. It must have seemed like an unsolvable crisis at the time. But with the emergence of antiretroviral therapies after the mid-90s, communities being at the heart of effective HIV testing and prevention methods, the world not only helped to slow a global pandemic, but several years ago set out that vision to actually end the epidemic by 2030. It's incredible that we are now at a moment in time where the majority of today's almost 40 million people living with HIV have access to medication each day. But it's also difficult to talk about the gains made without acknowledging those who lost their lives along the way. And as Noel said, people like Noel and Breda have seen it all over the last few decades. COVID-19 has shown a spotlight on global health, and with it the fact that, exactly as Noel said, the HIV/AIDS epidemic is still a global crisis. And seeing some of the comments come in, there is continued stigma, injustice, high rates of infection among key populations. These are some of the major barriers to reaching the 2030 targets that we've set. Not only are people living with HIV at higher risk from COVID-19, but are also negatively affected by the widespread disruption to health services. And I've seen that there's 800,000 children living with HIV currently not receiving life-saving treatment. This is actually the equivalent of almost every child in Ireland up to the age of 10, just putting it into Ireland, the global perspective. COVID-19 has highlighted that health is central to development. It's reignited policy discussions around global health security and reinforced the importance of dealing with underlying global, regional, and local inequalities and inequities. Global health it's deeply embedded in Ireland's international development policy, which is called A Better World. And Ireland's engagement in HIV and AIDS is rooted in an understanding of the relationship between poverty and poor health. Framed within our international development policy, our focus on HIV and AIDS is on prevention, support for health system strengthening, improvement of maternal and child health, and improving access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. Building upon our strong legacy of support for improved health in developing countries, Ireland has increased its support for health throughout the COVID pandemic, spending over €100 million this year, which includes increased support to the Global Fund to ensure HIV and AIDS remains a focus. Progress towards gender equality is also crucial to tackling HIV and AIDS through women and girls empowerment and the ability of all women and girls to express their human rights, including access and demand for sexual and reproductive health care. In Sub-Saharan Africa, as mentioned, women and girls accounted for 63% of all new HIV infections in 2020. Ireland's A Better World policy commits Ireland to addressing the structural and societal barriers to gender equality and to addressing the drivers and impacts of discriminatory gender norms and harmful masculinities. Access and demand for health services, including access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services, is fundamental for realising the sexual and reproductive health and rights and transforming women's health outcomes and in turn the health of their families and communities. Throughout the pandemic, we have actually continued to support the fight against HIV and AIDS through multiple avenues, such as multilateral partners such as UNAIDS, bilateral funding through our missions and directly through our global health and HIV and AIDS team partnerships. One of those partners our team has supported now for almost 2 decades is the International Partnership for Microbicides, which is working to develop cost-effective HIV prevention tools, such as the monthly dapivirine vaginal ring, that is a woman-centered prevention method. IPM are in the process of finalizing approval for the DVR in multiple countries currently. To reach those furthest behind and most marginalized, we've continued to support Frontline AIDS to implement their Rapid Response Fund and their Ready Plus program, which has enabled community-led innovative approaches to respond to the needs of people on the ground against the challenges of COVID-19. In 2020, the Rapid Response Fund adapted and expanded to support marginalized people deal with the stresses of COVID and associated measures put upon HIV services around the world, as well as new and exacerbated threats to human rights. Their Ready Plus program is working with local authorities and partners to ensure adolescents and young people living with HIV have access to treatment, comprehensive SRHR services, and psychosocial support where possible. Increasingly, and this is in line with what James has mentioned, our programs are focusing more on providing young people with the knowledge and information they need to protect themselves from contracting HIV, including through keeping girls in school and supporting comprehensive sexuality education. We are firm in our belief that education can make a significant difference, and it was great hearing that phrase from Father Michael Gelly that education is the social vaccine. We are a core funder of the UNESCO O3 program, which is the biggest comprehensive sexuality education program in Africa that aims for a Sub-Saharan Africa where adolescents and young people are empowered, are healthy, resilient, and have the capacity to reach their full potential and contribute to the development of their community, country, and region. We do this program in Ethiopia, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. And through our missions overseas, Ireland is supporting multiple frontline HIV and AIDS programs, such as the kind of projects James highlighted, the Karamoja United Nations HIV program led by UNAIDS, for example, which improves availability, access, and utilization of quality HIV and AIDS services. And also, just personally, during my time with Concern in Malawi, I was lucky to meet some of Concern's partners in Mangochi who led on HIV and AIDS awareness work as part of their comprehensive graduation program supported by Irish Aid. So the final partnership I'll talk about is it's the largest partnership of our Global Health HIV and AIDS team, and it's the Global Fund. So in July of this year, Ireland took over the board seat of the 0.7 constituency for a 2-year period at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which, as you all know, is the primary international funding body for tackling these 3 diseases. So the 0.7 constituency is comprised of Ireland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. We are one of the founding members of the Global Fund since 2002 and have contributed more than 240 million euro in core funding to the fund since then, reflecting our view that we see the Global Fund as one of the most effective organizations in global health, supporting and sustaining more resilient and longer, I suppose, more sustainable systems for health around the world. Having a seat at the table means that Ireland can participate in and influence the global health dialogue. So it allows us to maximize our contribution to informing and influencing the response to AIDS and increasingly in pandemic preparedness and response in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our board seat is an important one for the challenges ahead, and our constituency is an important voice at the Global Fund and has been instrumental in advocating for greater health systems, strengthening human rights and gender equality. The 2021 to 2023 period is a very strategic one for the Global Fund as development of the post-22 strategy is underway, and we're playing a key role in hopefully getting the new strategy approved by the board later this year. So just to sum up, these partnerships, many of which have been in place for decades, emphasize our continued commitment to ending the HIV and AIDS epidemic by 2030 and putting those most affected at the center of that commitment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ronan. Absolutely, really important. And many of us have been working in countries where the Global Fund is being implemented, doing stellar work, the Global ATM, as it's colloquially called, because it's supporting in terms of prevention, diagnosis and treatment for AIDS, TB, and malaria. Really important endemic diseases in countries like Kenya, Malawi, and where Concern is working. Like I said, the role of health security and health system strengthening in Concern likewise. The systems really have shown us, sadly, from Ireland to Geneva to Kenya, you know, have not been adequate in terms of stalling and containing the current pandemic. A lot of investment, especially in human resources, frontline workers, paying people to deliver the services will need to be invested in going forward as the economic impacts of both epidemics continue. And you mentioned there in terms of HIV deaths annually, I hadn't included it, but yeah, I was checking again that almost 700,000 people are still dying every year from HIV and AIDS related illnesses. Thanks to all of the speakers for their insightful comments. We're going to do a cafe style open panel discussion now, looking at the questions raised. So I hope people can continue to join us. We're exactly on time, which is brilliant. Thanks to everybody. And one of the first questions, it looks like I think it's related to Ronan, actually, or Irish Aid. I'm trying to find it here now. Question 6. Thanks, Elaine Becks, working in Burundi. Does Irish Aid plan to run a program in Burundi? I have worked in Burundi myself, but I actually don't know if Irish Aid is currently focused in Burundi.
We don't have a mission in Burundi, but I know I mean, it's possible the funding would support projects through multilateral programs, but I'd be happy to check with our colleagues in the Central African Division and follow up, find out more information. Thanks.
Thanks, yeah. Certainly there's risks and vulnerabilities, conflict related also in Burundi. Joan, can you put us all on screen together so we're equal? It's not my big head out there all by itself as an equal panel discussion here. And the first question is related to, and whoever, you know, everybody feel free to respond to the questions. How can we end HIV and AIDS when we still have in our communities the related stigma, discrimination, and criminalization? And certainly key populations are criminalized in many countries where Concern Irish Aid is working. After 40 years to still have HIV AIDS related deaths in 2021 is quite shocking. I agree, Elaine, and maybe Laurel and Spongale would speak to those points, please.
Sure, and thanks so much. It's a really important question, and I think it's something that we've all struggled with, and it really goes to the heart of why at UNAIDS we're now so focused on ending inequalities. Stigma and discrimination that people living with HIV and key populations face has been ubiquitous, and it's. I saw another question about U equals U and stigma and healthcare providers as well, and I think what we've learned time and again is that as new technologies and new innovations come forward, we keep expecting stigma to go away, and it keeps not going away. So I think we have to be really realistic about the limits of medical advances in addressing stigma and discrimination, while never denying how important those medical advances are for all of us living with HIV and people affected by HIV. And not, you know, not ignoring the power of the U equals U message, particularly for people living with HIV and key populations. But I think we you know, keep looking for a magic bullet to address these sort of intensely held biases, both related to HIV directly, but also related to key population status, LGBT, for, you know, those of us who are LGBT, people who are sex workers, people who use drugs, et cetera. We know those are long-standing prejudices. They've always been wrong. They're no less wrong now. They're no more wrong now. They've always been wrong, and they've been with us a really long time. So simply sharing information about infectiousness and risk of infection is important. It's important that people have accurate information. I just think back, we've known since 1994 that women living with HIV largely do not transmit HIV to their unborn children, as long as they're on medication. And we see horrifying levels of violence and discrimination against pregnant women living with HIV. So I think we should be very grounded in that reality and not use that to give up, but use that to fight even better. We do have, UNAIDS has put together a compilation, I'll look for the link and try to share it here, of evidence-based interventions that really work against stigma and discrimination. I think one of the biggest challenges we've had is that we can measure stigma and discrimination, and the PLHIV stigma index that we work on with GMP Plus and ICW and other partners, I think is a critical tool for both demonstrating the issues of discrimination and where they happen, and empowering people living with HIV, especially key populations living with HIV, to own and use that data for advocacy, but it's certainly not enough. What we actually need is real, consistent, sustainable funding for anti-stigma interventions and political leadership from the highest levels, and our advocacy really needs to focus on that. It does make a difference when we have political leadership speaking out against stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV, and HIV can be an entry point for addressing stigma and discrimination against key populations, but it can't be the end point, right? Because HIV is not the only thing that's driving the stigma and discrimination. And sometimes I think it's actually the third or fourth thing. It's like people can grab onto that and say it's because of HIV, but there are some deeper societal prejudices that many of us have been working on and many other communities have been working on for a long time. And I think we really need to build on what we know works, and then invest in communities to do the advocacy and to, you know, address self-stigma. As you know, of course, we all swim in the same water. We're all going to get wet. We all hear the terrible messages about all of our different communities. And so we also have to stand together to be able to fight back against terrible things that really, we hear about ourselves, and it can be very easy to absorb those and start to believe those. So I think we have to be smart and consistent and steady, and not give up when it continues to be a longer battle than any of us think it ought to be. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Laurel. Yes, and I'll hand over to Spongale, because positive speakers and colleagues of mine here in Ireland and in countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, positive speakers speaking out, I have found, my colleague James here in Ireland, who some people on the panel know and others, really does make it real for people to talk. Everybody has their issues, health or otherwise, and it's always more difficult for extremely poor people. So I'll let Spongale respond to that, and then James from the Kenya perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Laurel has said around like the social and the cultural prejudices. And I think there hasn't been enough, I think the stigma index is so great at identifying the stigma and highlighting the advocacy work. But I think more work needs to be done in terms of understanding the environment. What are some of the cultural prejudices that people still hold around the key population specifically, but also some of the societal perceptions that people hold in communities. And I don't think there hasn't been much around that. This week, we had a meeting with some of our partners and some of our networks. And one of the things that they highlighted was around narratives and language, that there's such a disjoint what we in the global health and also in the national health use, the narratives that we use and people on the ground. So sometimes there's actually a disjoint that is, and one of the questions I asked from that is that then how effective is our communications in terms of messaging around changing stigma, right? If people on the ground are saying that there's a big disjoint. So there's quite a lot of investment, a lot of work into understanding perception, into understanding what drives the stigma, not particularly amongst HIV positive people, but the communities that they surround with. So I totally agree with Laura.
Thanks very much, Spongale. And James, in Kenya, how has it been changing, or the young people you're working with, what's their perception? Do they feel more confident? What's the situation from your long years working on this issue in Kenya?
I think, as my colleagues have tried to put it, these are very deeply entrenched issues. It's not about, you also saw what happened when COVID came into the scene. There was immediate stigma and discrimination against people affected by COVID. But having said that, what I have seen work in Kenya, and I think concern programs have made very great strides in addressing these culturally rooted and socially rooted practices like stigma and discrimination, was the use of the community conversation tool, where you bring together communities, people who relate with each other, and they look into the issue, they delve into the issue like stigma and discrimination. And I'll give an example in the informal settlements of Nairobi. You find when in a community conversation group, you will find that group brings together everybody, including people living with HIV, and everybody embraces each other. We have had situations like even in the ASAL areas like Marsabit, we have one village, and as a result of community conversation work there, communities having dialogue, people who were ostracized by the members of the community because of their HIV status are now accommodated by the members of the community, and they themselves have accepted their status. They are accessing treatment, and they are also going out of their way, even in the informal settlement, not just to support each other as people living with HIV, but also supporting prevention activities among children, among youth, and among the other members of the community. But tied to that, I would say from my experience with HIV work, reduction of stigma is also tied to increase in treatment and care services. There is a strong correlation between reduction of stigma and increase in treatment and care services. The more accessible treatment and care services are, you find that the more accommodating and the less stigma that you find against people living with HIV. For the young people, we have embraced a model of community conversation for young people. We call it study circles for adolescent development, where young people come together and they pick a topic of a challenge that is facing them, be it drugs and substance abuse, risk of HIV infection, high risk sexual behavior, and they discuss it, and they discuss it openly. And this is, we facilitate those processes through use of simple tools like comic books that help them to make the discussions much easier and much more friendly, much more to make it more comfortable for the young people to discuss difficult topics in a language and in ways that suits them. So I think we have tools, we have the capacity, but we need to, like my colleague said, we have to keep at it. We don't give up. We have to keep at it because of the changes and the dynamics that are happening. So we have to keep adapting as we go along. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Absolutely. As I've often said in the past, HIV is spread individually one-to-one. Prevention has to be at an equally one-to-one dialogue. And this is ongoing. And I think, already the learning from the HIV response in terms of stigma and discrimination is informing COVID-19 response. And hopefully when we get through the COVID-19 response, we can look again to re-inform how we're doing on the HIV response globally. Moving quickly, because there's quite a few questions. Noel, for this one, I see you've answered a little bit, Noel, but accessibility to PrEP in Ireland and maybe joining ACT UP Dublin so people can have more access to people that they can talk to and speak to comfortably, because since we lost Open Heart House in Dublin, Ireland as a walk-in centre, it really has been difficult for people who are facing these issues at home alone, especially during the pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're right. Open Heart House was a huge loss. Everybody still talks about it to this day. ACT UP meet every sort of second and fourth Tuesday of every month. We have a Facebook page. We have an open Facebook page there as well, and Instagram and Twitter and stuff. We try and start updating people a bit more about meetings which are currently sort of virtual. So keep an eye on those sort of channels. The PrEP program sort of rolled out. So there are clinics around Ireland. If you go to sexualwellbeing.ie, which is part of the HSE, it'll probably tell you that the certificate for the site isn't available. Click yes, you can click to it. That's because of the IT issues they've had a while back. You'll get a list of where you can get PrEP around the country. Most of them operate out of clinics, from Ennis to the Mater to GMHS, St. Vincent's. Paddy Mallon set up a PrEP clinic out there. So you'll see a full list of around the country where you can go and get PrEP. You could get PrEP for free if you sort of qualify, if it's seen that you need it through the drugs repayment card system, which we have in Ireland. Also, you normally need to have a PPS number for that. If you don't have one, there are workarounds which are there. So if somebody's arrived in Ireland, doesn't have a PPS number, but they intend to stay or whatnot, there are sort of workarounds. The Empire program in HIV Ireland, run by Adam Shanley, is a great resource. They constantly sort of update, what clinics are open or not. Particularly the last year and a half has been very, very difficult. So keep an eye on that. And then there's also private services. There are GPs who can provide it, but you'll obviously have to pay a consultation fee for that. And when you go to the clinics, normally you get tested every 3 months. So it's a great way of engaging with services. So when you get your prescription, you'll get tested for HIV, but a variety of other STIs, and sometimes other things are picked up as well when you get blood screenings and whatnot. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Related to that, Noel, it's, I guess, for you as well, and those of us based in Ireland, it's being highlighted here that Romanian people are being left behind, picking up unused medication from other people, which is not a good approach, I guess. Is ACT UP able to reach out to new nationals, new Irish who may be facing these issues in direct provision or other places to be able to access the services?
Absolutely, yeah. And there's quite a few organisations which are quite good, and even though they mightn't be dealing directly with sort of HIV and whatnot, like even Massey or whatever, we all know each other, so word will come back, and so always get in contact with somebody. And then Richard in Assets as well is great for all that sort of stuff. And then I know HIV Ireland and Empower are starting to do more and more work now with very specific communities. So that's sort of the answer to that. Again, is that, yeah, it's probably better than it has been. Great,
yeah. So reach out, contact the organizations. Confidentiality will be protected. Any of us working in this know the trauma for people. Thanks, Noel. Maybe for Ronan and myself, and me especially, I see a question in here from Sudan, working in a very small village on community raising awareness on the stigma of other infectious diseases. How can I collaborate? I guess living in Sudan, Concern Worldwide has an office actually in Khartoum. It's my next country trip, most likely, coming up later this month. And I would encourage anybody online who wants to reach out to communicate with Irish Aid in our countries of operation, Concern Worldwide, UNAIDS offices, GMP Plus, reach out, pick up the phone, talk to somebody you trust. Anything you want to say on that, Ronan?
Yeah, just exactly what you said, Rita. I mean, connect with the missions on the ground, the country offices of different organizations. I guess, yeah, it's often difficult if you're a very small community level organization, but that's often the advantage of connecting with larger national NGOs or international NGOs that are working in that area to collaborate on programs. So we would always encourage that. I mean, the missions have separate funding streams for different programs that are happening separate, and that's done from our side of the headquarters. And then, yeah, connect with other UN agencies on the ground, see what other funding opportunities are available that come up. And then just as James was saying, just we need to keep at it and not take the foot off the gas, I suppose. Even at the local level, what might seem like a very small community action is what's needed to catalyze the larger one at the national level and then international again. So, yeah.
Great. Mute myself. Thanks, Ronan. Absolutely. Reach out to UNAIDS, to Irish Aid, to Concern Worldwide in our offices. Make that call. Don't, as I think it was Laurel said, and it's in all our messages these days, don't let's leave anyone behind. Every infection averted, prevented is success. It means, that person on treatment becomes undetectable and not able to pass the infection on to anybody else. As we're near the end, I'd just like to go back to everybody in terms of leading up to World AIDS Day. We don't know the theme yet, Laurel. Maybe you have it there. It's not on the UNAIDS website yet. But let's go back to the beginning, and one last message or a clarion call from firstly Spongale, then to Laurel, James, Noel, and Ronan. Thank you. Spongale?
Yeah, I think obviously with, one of the things that was highlighted today is the importance of work specifically for the key populations now. And what does that mean then? How do we integrate the PLHIV networks with the networks from the key populations such as LGBTIQ, the sex workers, people using drugs? How do we build solidarity together with those networks in ending AIDS, and also some of the barriers that we talked about today. But I think more than anything, the political declaration is always like a guiding document in ending AIDS, and we saw the last one. We were all disappointed that we did not reach our targets. And therefore, this time around, I think we need to all the partnerships needs to be serious in terms of implementation. And on our side, that's what we want to really focus on as GNP Plus, is that how do we build stronger accountability mechanisms so that we are able to reach those targets, because it's no longer time for words anymore. It's time for actions. 2030 is just around the corner. And therefore, it's really, really important that we reach those targets. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Spangale. Laurel?
Yeah, thank you. It's been such a real pleasure to be part of this conversation and to learn from everyone here and to get these really important questions and conversation going. In terms of the World AIDS Day question, what we're expecting, we've had some internal conversations. What we're expecting is that it will be something along the lines of ending inequalities, right? So sort of following up on the theme that we've been pushing throughout the year. So I'm not sure if there's a snappier title, but I think that's probably as snappy as we can get. It's snappier than UNAIDS usually manages. So, but I would anticipate you'll see something very similar to that. And yeah, just really want to echo Sibangile on the missed targets. Let's not stop grieving in a way that we did miss those, that these were achievable. They were ambitious, but achievable. Some countries did achieve them. They were doable. And yet, as a globe, we missed them and didn't have the commitment needed to realize them. So we have another chance. We can still get the world back on track by 2025 in order to end the AIDS epidemic, at least as a public health threat, by 2030. Of course, there'll be lots of us still around, I hope, live, kicking and well, living with HIV. So we're not getting rid of people with HIV, but certainly we want to stop people from dying, people from being sick, and new infections. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to join you today.
Much appreciated, Laurel. Yes, I'm feeling highly motivated again to be working and speaking with people who are working on the front line from different angles. Every contribution is important. James in Kenya. And yes, I'm glad you reminded us of Father Michael J. Kelly, respect to him, and he'll be certainly marked at the Irish World AIDS Day event on the 1st of December. Education is the social vaccine. So what's your last message to us from Nairobi, James, as we head up?
Yeah, I think just like we look at grade 1, 2, and 3 as the building blocks for literacy and numeracy, we need to look at the age 10, especially to 14 up to 18 as the building blocks for prevention of HIV infection among the adults population. And we maximize on that age group through life skills education, so that they are better able to protect themselves from HIV and other challenges, and therefore be able to maximize and live their full potential. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, James. Great. The line held up all the way. Noel, from the advocacy, activism, artists, community, national to international side.
I think, well, obviously World AIDS Day it's also a remembrance, but it's a very useful day to use, as the previous speakers have said, for sort of where we need to get to and getting our messages out. And certainly miss Father Michael Kelly as well. He was fantastic, but thankfully he will be also remembered, particularly in Ireland, but also worldwide. So yeah, it's really still a very important and useful day, as I said, not just for remembrance, but it sort of keeps people focused and reminds the world as to where we need to be and how to get there.
Thanks very much, Noel, and over to Ronan.
Yeah, I would just echo other speakers about keeping energy up, learning as well from the lessons. I mean, learned decades of lessons learned now that we can also apply to COVID, maintaining communities most affected at the center of the response, wanting to actually invest in like accessible, stronger, like more sustainable health systems, and then recovering better, I suppose, with our kind of global health architecture from this crisis. There's lots of questions up in the air of the role of different organizations, and some of those conversations can get lost in the technicalities, but what we just need to remember is the people at the actual center of these conversations that we're talking about. Just from our side, we have a responsibility to continue funding, to commit to supporting our partners, and we just want to use this event, the next event coming up in December, to just keep that focus, keep that energy, to try reaching those targets by 2030. So yeah, I just want to thank the other speakers and everyone today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ronan. And on my side, closing and handing back to Joan in a sec. You know, it's reminding us in Concern Worldwide, we need to mainstream and integrate our responses in all our sector programs, in livelihoods, education, health, multi-sector programs, in all contexts, especially conflict-affected development and emergency contexts, with all the sad conflicts ongoing, that we need to do everything we can to safeguard, especially the young people James was talking about, to reduce risk and vulnerability, to help to interrupt transmission and to prevent new infections, as well as supporting people who are newly diagnosed this current year to access treatment sustainably, quickly. And my last point, I always like to think, you know, HIV, it can be depressing. It's going on a long time. We're not through it yet, but HIV, hope is vital. That's what it also stands for. So thanks very much. I really appreciate the motivating and inspiring contributions from everybody today. And thanks to Joan, Maisie and Noor in the background. And over to you, Joan, to end the session. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Breda. A big thanks to you as well for stepping in last minute to take over all the moderation. And thanks to all our speakers. If you found our event useful, if you could please take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation form that appears in the chat. Thanks to all the attendees for joining and interacting during the webinar. A recording of today's event will be on our YouTube channel on globalhealth.ie, but also we'll be sending it in the follow-up Zoom mails. Thanks everyone, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone. Have a good evening, afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Much appreciated.